Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we dig into democratic socialism and its allure to millennials. In the second half of our show, we'll speak with Matt Kibbe, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Austrian Economics Center and author of Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Jared Meyer, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the co-author of Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young. Jared, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me again.
Jared, it's great to have you on from time to help us keep our finger on the pulse of your fellow millennials. I ask you to join us today to help explain the allure of democratic socialism. Let me play you a brief clip from Saturday Night Live and then ask you just what democratic socialism is.
Hold on, wait a second! I am so sick of the 1% getting this preferential treatment. Enough is enough. We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
Democratic socialism.
What's the difference?
Huge difference.
Huge?
Huge.
Okay, Jared, what do people who grew up after the fall of the Berlin Wall make of all this?
Well, they define socialism much differently than previous generations of Americans, if they can even define socialism at all. So if you ask millennials what they actually think socialism is, only 16% can correctly say that it's government control of the production process. The other ones really define it however they want, whatever fits their policy priorities. So when Bernie Sanders and other people are going around saying that they're a proponent of democratic socialism, people are able to fill in the blanks and define it as just pushing for policies that they agree with.
That's a pretty powerful message, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's always kind of been hip among college students, even back when it was real socialism, to align with that ideal. And if we look at it right now, about the same proportion of college students favor socialism as the proportion who favor capitalism.
Wow.
Yeah, it's something that, continues to hold popularity when I guess you're not paying any taxes and not actually in the workforce yet.
What impact does the dismal history of socialism have on young people compared to the glowing promises socialism has always offered?
I think the idea is that today it's different. So socialism, it was tried in the past, but they say now we're looking to more democratic socialism where it's not fully the government owning the production process. I mean, what millennial could you find who would honestly want Washington to tell Apple how many iPhones they can make or what features they can put in the iPhone 7? No one wants that, but instead what they want is some way to combat income inequality, which they see as a major problem, and also something that it's, frankly, I guess more interesting politicians are promoting this right now. So they see it as something fun and hip to look at while glancing over the abysmal failure of true socialism in the past.
Do they pay any attention to what's going on in Venezuela?
I think they really don't. And if they do, they'll say, no, that's not true socialism because the people aren't having enough of a voice. That's just, the 1% controlling socialism, where we need true socialism, where we take the proceeds of the market because they still believe in markets. I mean, look at millennials' near universal respect for entrepreneurs such as Steve Jobs. And 2/3 of millennials want to start a business at some point in their life. So they believe in the market. But what they're saying is we need to take the proceeds from the market and spread those around in a way that they deem to be more fair.
What about Sweden and Denmark? Aren't they held up as models for democratic socialism?
Yes, especially in the U.S., even though, surprisingly, if you look at the ranking of countries by economic freedom, Finland, Denmark, other Scandinavian countries, Norway, they're really not that far behind the U.S. But in one area where they differ drastically is how progressive their tax code is. So the U.S. has a very progressive tax code where wealthy people have to pay much higher tax rates. But if you look at the Scandinavian countries, the U.S. tax code is about 5 times as progressive as theirs. So the middle class there is paying a lot of money in taxes to fund all the services that the government provides. Americans haven't come along, especially young Americans, to the realization that if they want policies that are going to give out more free stuff and more redistribution of income, it's their incomes, the middle class's income that's going to be redistributed.
They're not taxing the man behind the tree. They're taxing themselves.
Yep, and Americans will not stand for that.
You know, you point out about the rich paying higher tax rates. I'm not sure that's entirely correct. They pay a higher tax take. The total amount of the tax burden supported by the rich, I think, is larger in the United States than anywhere else. But the nominal marginal rate at the top tax bracket is certainly exceeded in other places, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I would just say on a ratio, so even if Scandinavian countries have a higher top tax rate, the level that they're taxing their middle class at is much higher. I mean, in the U.S., less than 3% of total federal income taxes are paid by the bottom half of income earners. Whereas in Scandinavian countries, you have them paying a much larger proportion, which makes it that the U.S. is 5 times more progressive in its tax code.
Let's come back around to income inequality, which seems to be the hottest issue, certainly on the Democratic side. Are those whose main concern is income inequality in favor of income equality? And what would income equality look like?
I don't think they're in favor of total income equality. They understand that when someone takes a risk and starts a business, they're entitled to some sort of rewards. But they have this idea that the rich don't pay their fair share of taxes right now, and they don't connect that a lot of people who are making money have invested a lot of time and effort into building their careers or building their companies. And I think a lot of this is because they really haven't entered the workforce. But if you asked any of them, hey, let's say you started the next Facebook, do you think you should have to give all your proceeds then to the government? I don't think you'd find any millennials who would think that. They'd say, that's my money. I've earned it, unlike all those rich fat cats right now who are making up the top 1%.
Well, let's go back to the perception that the rich aren't paying their fair share. If you look at the share data, the top 1%, the top 10%, and the top 20% are carrying hugely disproportionate amounts of the total load. Where do they get the idea that the tax code is so unfair?
I think if you just say things enough on TV and on social media, people just start to think it's true because you're exactly right. When you look at the data, it shows that everyone in the top quarter of income earners is paying a larger share of federal income taxes than they take in income. So while there are cases where you'll see people who are gaining most of their income from capital gains paying a lower tax, when it comes to the income tax, people are paying much more when they're top earners than they're receiving proportionally.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt's getting surprisingly little attention in today's political conversation. Was he also a democratic socialist because he introduced public make-works projects, expansive welfare spending, and a massive tax increase? Or was he a democratic fascist because he cartelized industry, ordered the slaughtering of livestock while people were starving just to try to raise farm prices, and arrested shopkeepers who refused to knuckle under to government price fixing?
Well, I think what we see is when people are idolizing FDR, they're looking at part of his platform. They think you can have democratic socialism without all the bad side effects. But if you're going to give government enough power to be able to fully redistribute income and also get into the lives of Americans at a level really we haven't seen before, there are going to be a lot of negative consequences that are going to come with that. So while they definitely don't want government to own certain industries, I'd say when you start building the level of government higher and higher, you're going to start seeing spillover, as we have in Venezuela and other socialist countries, Cuba, where it's become really a problem, and it's standing in the way of prosperity for its citizens rather than providing them with more income and goodies.
Public schools teach that the Great Depression was caused by greed and that the New Deal, with the help of World War II, brought recovery. Do millennials buy that narrative?
I think they do because it's what they've been taught in school, and it also fits into the worldview that a lot of them have. Look at what they're being taught about the 2008 crisis. The same thing. Greed led to it, and thankfully government stepped in before the whole economy entirely fell apart. So when you're being taught this in school and not hearing the other side, that there were many factors, some of which government contributed to in leading up to both of these crises, that's what they're going to think, is that it was the free market that's to blame, and we need to rein in the excess of a capitalistic system. I would say that's one of the best ways to describe millennial support for democratic socialism. They think capitalism works, at least somewhat well, but you need government to step in and take away the excess and the greed that they see as perverting the system.
What trusted sources do millennials go to get their facts and information and history?
Probably BuzzFeed. That's probably number one. But a lot of it's on social media, which can work for, of course, people on both sides of the aisle and regardless of your age when you're hearing an echo chamber of people you tend to agree with. But I would say rather than going and looking at the underlying data, I know in the most recent Democratic debate, Bernie Sanders brought up that the unemployment rate for African-American teenagers was over 50%. That's just not true. If you go and actually look at government data, he's defining it in a different way. But because people hear this and it gets shared on social media, they start to accept it as true. I think that's the same thing as we saw with the claim that the rich aren't paying their fair share.
Well, which proves that narratives are more important than facts.
At least when it comes to politics, definitely.
So, Jared, if democratic socialism prevails, entitlement spending is jacked up, and government debt grows even more unsustainable, who do millennials think are going to end up getting stuck with the bill?
Well, I think a lot of them, they prefer to not think about the problem because, surprisingly, millennials have about the same level of support for entitlement programs as older generations do. But they do, at least in the ones that I've talked to and in the surveys I've seen, they don't expect that they're going to get the full amount they're paying in back. And if current trends continue, that's, assuming we don't go and expand the program as democratic socialists would have us do, the program's going to be bankrupt by 2034. And we're going to see Medicare be bankrupt by 2030. By those times, millennials are only going to be receiving about 3/4 of what they were promised for the programs. So they continue to pay into these programs, and I think it's just become a near acceptance. I know one millennial who I spoke with, he told me he just views the Social Security payments that come out of each paycheck as nothing more than another tax. He said he doesn't even expect to get a single cent back.
Well, he got that right. So why are they okay with it?
That's a great question. Another young person I talked to, she said she understands that we have a duty to take care of older Americans, but she worries that the program has gotten so out of hand that it's lost its initial vision, which was to help keep retirees out of poverty. But now when we're entering an age where the average household headed by someone 65 years or older has about 50 times the wealth of a household headed by someone 35 years or younger, Social Security isn't just transferring wealth from the young to the old, it's transferring from the poor to the wealthy.
In 3.5 years, I stick my nose in the trout, and you guys are going to be paying my wine bill. How are you going to like that?
Well, that exactly shows how the realities faced by today's seniors have changed drastically for the better. I mean, if you can afford wine, this is this is going to be a good retirement for you. But when the realities change, we need these programs to change as well. And unfortunately, democratic socialists support expanding Social Security, not putting in place common sense reforms that will gradually raise the retirement age or lower the rate of benefit growth. And I know Bernie Sanders, he even said that Social Security is the most successful program in government history.
Well, what do millennials think about just means testing Social Security and taking it away from people like me?
That's something that I've found pretty wide support from among young people, but unfortunately, I can't get much support on this from Social Security defenders in Congress. Because if we do start means testing it where we don't let wealthy retirees receive the full benefits they were promised, that shows the system for what it really is, another tax and transfer program, not simply a forced savings program.
So on the one hand, they know they're getting screwed by Social Security, but how politically potent is the promise of free college as well as the forgiveness of all college loans?
Well, free college sounds great. You can put it on a bumper sticker, you can chant it at rallies, but the reality is not that simple. Right now, one of the main reasons why college tuition has skyrocketed is because the government has been pouring near endless amounts of money into the higher education system. And the best way to understand this is they're essentially writing a blank check to colleges, saying build all the water slides you want, hire all the administrators you want, put up that new building, and jack up your tuition. But don't worry, we'll just cover it based on student loans because part of how it's determined is how much it costs to go to college.
I'm still very involved with my alma mater, MIT, and the number of administrators compared to the number of faculty has just exploded. Doesn't anyone see that?
I wish people would see it because we have proposals on both sides of the aisle for how to fix America's higher education system. We all know there's over $1 trillion in student loan debt, but until we address the main reason that we keep driving up the cost of college through fixing our government student loan program, all these other solutions that are just tinkering on the side are just putting a Band-Aid over the real problem.
You know, democratic socialism seems to be set in some kind of manufacturing golden age when people had jobs for life, union membership, and defined benefit pension plans. How does this fit with the gig economy that millennials have to deal with?
Well, I think a lot of policymakers, it's not just those who support democratic socialism, sort of idealize the 1950s and, as you said, the manufacturing golden age. But we're far beyond that now. And young people, at least when you look at what they're actually doing with their careers, they've moved beyond it too. The union membership rate for people 16 to 24 is at pretty much an all-time low of 4.5%, whereas 14% of people 45 to 64 are members of unions. So young people realize that unionization in an inflexible workforce isn't what they're looking for right now. So while they might support unions in theory, and if you see any public polling on millennials and unions, they say they're great, they're not willing to actually give up a part of their paycheck to enter what's essentially become a Ponzi scheme in many broke union pension funds.
Democratic socialist countries like Greece have a culture where people flock to civil service jobs. That's considered great success. Are millennials interested in government civil service jobs?
Millennials have a very low trust rate for government, and they view people running for office or going to work for government as self-interested. They don't view it as a noble career as young people did in the past. And I really can't blame them. When you look at what members of both parties have done to young people's futures, it's no surprise that they're disillusioned with politics as usual, and they don't see Washington as solving their problems. They're much happier to look to innovative private sector companies who have delivered results for them while they've been left waiting for government to do anything to help them out.
Well, be that as it may, you've reported that fewer than 4% of private businesses are at least partially owned by someone under the age of 30, which is the lowest proportion since the Federal Reserve began collecting data on that nearly a quarter century ago. What's wrong with you people?
That's a great question because millennials have entrepreneurial dreams. Again, 2/3 want to start a business at some point, but they're not following through on them. And I think student loan debt plays into this, but also the current regulatory scheme we see, especially on the federal level, is holding back people from starting businesses. And you can see this in a variety of sectors. But the main thing we need to keep a focus on is that millennials don't view regulation in the same way that previous generations did. They don't think government can just come in and fix it. In fact, only 18% of millennials primarily think regulators have public safety in mind when they're crafting their new commandments. So they see that when you have a state or local government coming in and shutting down Uber, they don't like that very much. So they start to become much more free market, at least when it comes to their views on regulation.
Yet they seem to have bought in the global warming hysteria and are supporting regulations to pretty much shut down conventional energy production.
The reason I would say that's the case is, let's think, you flick your light switch and the light comes on. The regulation that affects the production of energy is so far removed from a person that if you're not really thinking about it, you may not notice. Whereas, again, on the other hand, when a government bureaucrat comes in and stands between you and your Uber, you're definitely going to notice that.
So as various factions struggle for the hearts and minds of millennials, what became of the libertarian moment, particularly on college campuses? Did it collapse along with Rand Paul's presidential aspirations?
I don't think it did, because the idea of the libertarian moment wasn't really the hope to elect a libertarian president, but rather it's the greater appreciation for individual freedom in all areas of people's lives. So we've seen great success on a lot of social issues that young people have embraced, and I think once they start earning some money, they're going to come around to the economic side. Even right now, when we look at it, a lot of people will say, if you pose the question to millennials, do you want a bigger government with more services or a smaller government with fewer services? Millennials overwhelmingly support the bigger government. But as soon as you add in a little caveat of you're going to have to pay more taxes to fund the bigger government, it flips. And then you have more people, actually 60% of millennials, supporting a smaller government with fewer services.
But they've all been sold on the idea that the rich are going to pay for it all, and they're not going to have to lift a finger.
Oh, especially when it comes to things like free college. It's supposed to be paid for through just taxes on the rich. But if you look at it, surprisingly, because free college is championed by the same people who think income inequality is the defining challenge of our time, over $56 billion of the $70 billion that Senator Sanders' plan for free college would cost would go to people with above average incomes. That's 80% of the total is going to the upper middle class and the rich. If you care about income inequality, there's much better ways to help low-income families and low-income students achieve more economic opportunity than throwing a bunch of money at upper-middle-class students.
You know, Jared, as I graze social media, one of the things I really notice is that the language and vocabulary used by millennials seems to be different, certainly different from us baby boomers. What's going on there?
Well, I think the clearest area you can see this is between capitalism and socialism. So thankfully, even though the boomers and the silent generation, they left us with lots of debt when it comes to entitlement programs, they did pretty much once and for all end the debate between what's better, true capitalism or true socialism. When it comes to millennials, if you ask them, do you favor capitalism or socialism, it's very close. It's about in line with each other. But when you flip it to saying, do you favor free markets or a government-managed economy, 65% favor a free market, whereas only less than a third favor a government-managed, which is right in line with the total population. So they're using a different vocabulary to describe the political system that they want. They do not want government managing the economy.
What does the word fairness mean to millennials?
Well, fairness is always a popular political word because everyone can define it how they want. But I think what they're looking for is that they don't want a system that's rigged, whereas there's certain people who are able to step outside of the rules and gain special treatment at the expense of other people. And that's where we could see kind of the hatred of Wall Street coming in from millennials who identify with democratic socialism. They feel as if the system is rigged so that people who with access to political capital and additional funds are able to rig the system towards their favor. I don't think you're going to find many people who want an entirely equal system when it comes to income, but they do want one where people aren't able to buy special privilege from government.
So if the young are concerned about rigged systems and corporate cronyism, how do they feel about candidates who rail against Wall Street and then collect $250,000 speaking fees to go and fawn on them?
Well, I think that's what we're seeing is how much Bernie Sanders is ahead of Hillary Clinton among young voters. They see the sort of hypocrisy there where she claims to be fighting against Wall Street, yet if you look at her past record, she has spent a lot of time and gotten a lot of money on working with Wall Street. I guess it could be expected as a senator from New York, but unfortunately in today's political environment, especially running against a self-proclaimed democratic socialist, that record doesn't play too well with young voters.
Jared, this whole debate over democratic socialism looks so muddled from the vantage point of age. What hope do you hold that members of your generation will ultimately sort all this out? You know what Churchill supposedly said about the young's attraction to socialism.
Well, of course, that anyone who's young and a conservative doesn't have a heart, and anyone who's old and a liberal doesn't have a brain. But I think part of that will play in here, especially when it comes to economics. Once young people start entering the workforce and they don't face the large unemployment rate that they're facing right now, they're going to realize just how much of their income is going to fund government services. And they'll realize that there is a lot that they're able to do just by building their own lives where they don't need government to provide services for them cradle to grave. If you look at Scandinavian countries, they don't have on a whole the same idea that Americans do. Americans are not settlers. They're not happy enough just getting by. They always want to strive to the next goal. And I think young people, that's especially true for them. They won't even settle on just a basic job that provides 9-to-5 income. They want to find meaning in everything that they do. So once they start entering the workforce with their already strong opposition to overbearing government regulation, I think they'll come around to realize that many high-income earners fully deserved every cent they got, and that people like Steve Jobs contributed far more to the U.S. economy and people's lives than he ever took in profits.
Jared, it's always fun having you on. Thanks for being on the show, and good luck paying my bills.
Thanks again. Always happy to come on the show.
That was Jared Meyer from the Manhattan Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. While you're at it, take a look at realclearmarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Today's program was partially underwritten by the generous support of Old Boston Restorations, a Victorian property management company in Boston's South End. Ahead, we'll speak with political activist Matt Kibbe, who was unceremoniously booted out of the FreedomWorks advocacy group he helped founded by threatened GOP insiders. Stay tuned.